I am Professor Lynn Porter from Fairfield University, and this is my lecture on ancient Greek architecture and decor. So these are all the categories that I'm going to cover in this lecture, starting with where we are in the world, when we are in the world, design principles and construction techniques, innovations, and public buildings, moldings, motifs, furniture, decorative arts, and eventually sculpture. So these are all of the topics I'm going to be discussing in this lecture. Okay, when we're talking about ancient Greece, we're not necessarily talking about the country of Greece as we think of it today. Yes, we're still talking about that corner of the world, but it's a little more complicated than that. And I include this map because I like to show the entirety of the Mediterranean. Because while Greece is there in the middle, that weirdly shaped smattering of islands, they're also not very far from the boot of Italy or from the what we now call Turkey, or even look down south. There we are at the top of Egypt. So there was international travel, interstate travel between all of these areas because of the centrality of the Mediterranean. But narrowing in on more specifically, when we're talking about the ancient Greek world, we're talking about everything that's colorful in this picture, from at the top with Macedonia all the way down to Athens in orange, Sparta in red, the great big island of Crete, and even some smatterings on that orange side over into what is now Turkey, that's labeled there as the brown is the Persian Empire. Okay, so everything there involved in the colorful parts of this map is where we're talking about. And I want to point out again, there's a tremendous amount of coastline. So this is a culture centered around the sea and being on the sea. But when are we talking about here? We break the ancient Greek world down into three big chunks. The first one is the Archaic period from about 1000 years BCE up until about 480 before the Common Era. Then there's the Classical period, which is what most of us think about when we're thinking about ancient Greece. So that's about from 480 BCE until 323 BCE, which isn't very long. That's like 150 years. And then the Hellenistic period, that's about another 150, 200 years, from 323 until 146 BCE, when the Romans conquer the Greek world. So archaic, classical, and Hellenistic. Those are the three biggies, and they have three very distinct visual styles, and that's what we're going to unpack here today. Overall, we're going to be looking at a series of unique design principles to the Greek world. And this first one is really, really big. The Greeks were all about finding perfection, finding the perfect proportion. And a lot of this had to do with understanding how Mother Nature has made perfect things and how we can extrapolate mathematically from what Mother Nature is doing. So let me get into the golden ratio, which is mathematically 1 to 1.618. It sounds like a really random number, doesn't it? But it comes from that magic sequence, the Fibonacci sequence, where you take two numbers and you add them together, and then you take those last two numbers and add those together, and eventually you get this really long string of numbers into infinity that have this wonderful relationship here. But really, applying it to physical objects is what the Greeks did. So if we look at that rectangle, the pink one, that's that's rectangle AB, right? So that is a golden rectangle. It has that 1 to 1.618 relationship. But then if you lay it next to a square, which is the purple side, then the whole thing combined becomes another golden rectangle. So this is something that you can scale up or scale down an infinite number of times. And that's part of the real magic of it. So once you start to divide it this infinite number of times, you also can then start to plot those relationships and you start to get what's called the golden spiral, which mathematically helps describe that wonderful spiral that Mother Nature uses when she grows things like pine cones, and the various leaves of the pine cone lay in that wonderful spiral pattern. And you're starting to think, yeah, but what does this have to do with architecture? Boom, there it is. Here we have an image of the Parthenon, the iconic image from ancient Greece. And look, there you go. There's that golden spiral. There's that magic golden ratio. There have been lots of theories in the millennia since the Parthenon was built that this ratio was an important part of how the architects and the engineers designed their buildings. Of course, we don't have their drawings, so we don't know exactly what they used to build these structures from. But it's a pretty compelling photograph, isn't it? Hmm. Okay, so in addition to looking for perfect proportions, we could certainly say that Greek architecture is designed for its functionality. It's not decorated for decoration's sake. Whatever decoration there is absolutely helps define the overriding structure of the piece itself. And architecture also has everything to do with symmetry and simplicity and this sense of repose, the sense of it being very calm. And all of this comes down to this idea of beauty, that everything is, we're trying to get more and more beautiful, and perfection and beauty are absolutely linked together. So let's look at the construction techniques that the ancient Greeks used. Everything uses the column and lintel form. And remember, that's what we call trabeated construction. So you have a post or a column and a lintel sitting on top of a series of columns. Remember, columns don't just exist to jut up out of the earth. They exist in order to hold things up. And they hold things up by having that lintel, that beam. And then on top of that, you can have your ceiling, you can have your roof, you can have all kinds of stuff up there, but you need the column to hold it up. Of course, the Greeks refined the column into very specific shapes and sizes and proportions. And they were also the first to use a column on the outside of the building. We've seen columns in ancient Egypt, but they were on the inside of the building. Here, they're actually on the outside. The Greeks were also the first to develop the truss instead of just a flat lintel or a flat roof. Now, a truss is that triangular shape to the end of the building, and that triangular shape is called the pediment. And we're going to see in subsequent pictures how that pediment also is an invitation to do some decoration. This is really, really important. The Greeks did not use the arch or the dome. Those shapes are not Greek. So I mentioned that they refined the shape of the column, and they got really specific about it. The orders of architecture are these three different styles and proportions that are used in the architecture. First, you have the Doric, then the Ionic, and then the Corinthian column. So these three different kinds of columns are what we call the orders of architecture. Okay, we'll start with the simplest form, the Doric structure. One of the most important differentiations between these different orders is the capital. The capital is that decorative doodah that sits on top of the column before you get to the lintel. Now, the Doric, here I've shown you a capital here on the left, it basically is just this circular kind of a squashed bun shape that's sitting on top of the column. And when you look at this overall shape, they feel older, they feel massive, they feel powerful. There's a strength to the Doric order. Here we have a temple of Hephaestus in Athens, which is one of the more complete temples that we have in that corner of the world. And it's absolutely Doric. Look how strong and massive those columns look. They look like a temple to a strong god. And of course, Hephaestus was one of the physically strongest gods. But then when we look at the Ionic order, we see that decorative capital that has these spirals, these volutes that form that beautiful spiral. Okay, and these are also on more slender columns, so it tends to have a lighter, more graceful, more feminine look than the solid, chunky look of the Doric order. And here, I hope you can see the difference here between this arrangement than what we just saw on that temple to Hephaestus, right? This is on the Acropolis in Athens, the Erechtheion. And these are absolutely beautiful, delicate, lovely Ionic columns. And the third order in ancient Egypt is the Corinthian order. This is obviously much more decorative, isn't it? It's much more complicated than either the Doric or the Ionic. In fact, it's got pieces of the Ionic in it. See, there's several volutes in there, those spirals, but then now it's surrounded by this double row of acanthus leaves. So it's very delicate, it's very rich and graceful and definitely feminine. And here in this portion of the Temple of Olympian Zeus in Athens, you see these beautiful Corinthian columns. Oh, yeah. So now I want to start looking at how the Greeks actually used these orders of architecture within their various structures. And we're only going to focus on public buildings in this lecture. And while I've listed 4 different types of public buildings that the Greeks built and we still see pieces of throughout Greece, we're going to focus on the first 2. So looking more specifically at temples, most of us know that the Parthenon in Athens, it's like one of the most famous, most important buildings in the world. Most of us know that that is a temple to Athena. And so I just wanted to point out these are different ground plan views of different Greek temples. So they used those columns and walls in multiple arrangements, even in the circular tholos arrangement. So let's start getting specific here. This is a map of the Acropolis in Athens. So we're going to focus on several different structures around the Acropolis, but we're going to be taking a look up here at the Parthenon, that most famous building. But there's lots of other things we've been looking at here. Those Ionic columns we were looking at were on this building over here. We have a theater down here. We have another theater down here. We've got this grand walkway coming up to the Parthenon, up through this really beautiful gate. So there's multiple things going on with this structure. But first, I want to focus on the Parthenon. This is another map of the Acropolis that's, I think, a little bit easier to see where all of these pieces are. Okay, so let's look specifically at the Parthenon. This is a peripteral style temple, which basically I've given you the ground plan of it there. Basically, it is surrounded by that series of columns, and then there is an inner structure. Those are those solid walls, and then it leads into the statue. This is a temple to Athena, so there was a statue to Athena inside the temple. Here's looking at it in real life. This is the east end with one of those solid walls. The cella is that interior room inside the temple. You can see the beginning of the pediment there. We've lost the very tippy top of the triangle, but you have the pediment. And look at that. This is a temple to Athena, and they used Doric columns. This is another view on the north side of the temple, so you get a sense of the length of the overall building. And of course, we know that over the millennia, this building has fallen apart, been taken apart, it's been exploded apart over the years. So it's in various stages of reconstruction and deconstruction over the years. Speaking of reconstructions, you may not know this, but in Nashville, Tennessee, there is a replica of the Parthenon using contemporary materials. There's a strong Greek immigrant group within the Nashville area that built the Parthenon as best as they could, imitating what we think it really looked like. So the Parthenon in Nashville gives us a really good sense of what it might have looked like. And I'm very sorry that this isn't a clearer image. I don't quite know what happened here. But yes, you have these columns that are Doric. We see that from their capital. And also, I want to point out that columns are not straight-sided. There's actually, I'm going to exaggerate it here. There's actually a bit of a bulge called an entasis there in the center that allows them to look straight, but they have a bulge in them to make them look straight even though they're not. There's many optical illusions built into this building in order to make it look like all of the edges are straight. Okay, so we have our columns here. We have our beam across called the architrave. There's a decorative element across here with multiple sculptures in there. And then we have our triangular pediment on top with this opening in the middle called the tympanum that then was filled with sculptural decorations. We know from the written record that the building housed a solid gold statue of Athena. She was the patron god of the town of Athens. So this is an artist's rendering of what we think that statue looked like inside the temple. And in Nashville, they have actually built an Athena statue using modern materials. But I include this to show you a sense of scale because, yes, that is a human man. And so we're talking about a massive, massive structure. Everything about the Parthenon was to the glory of Athena. So that's a massive temple, the Parthenon, but I want to show you one other one. I want to show you the temple of Athena Nike, which is right here. In this map, the temple of Athena Nike, right there at the very entrance of the Propylaea, which is this massive gate that you have to walk through in order to get up to the top of the mountain. There you go. This is a temple to Athena, the victorious Athena, right there at the opening gate. And this is a much smaller, infinitely smaller temple, but very delicate, very feminine. Yes, this also did have a pediment on top of it, but it's really, really small, but so graceful. Another view of it, how graceful, how beautiful, so tiny and gorgeous. In this image, you actually see some pieces that have been put on uh, in restoration. Those are the really white pieces, so you see more of the pediment in this. This also shows how it's kind of hanging off the side of the mountain and it's out over the vista of that portion of the city of Athens. And one more temple structure I want to share with you is at the Temple of Athena at Delphi, not in Athens. This is a Tholos style temple. That I think you noticed that round temple in that diagram. So this is what one might have looked like. Obviously, it's only partially restored, but there was an outer ring of columns and then this inner walled structure that you could then get into this inner area to talk with Athena. So while the Greeks only had a few things to use, a few orders of architecture and this idea of a column and a lintel, they found many different ways to express their ideas through their temples. I also promised you that we would look at their theaters. And the theaters were built into the side of a hill, so they were carved out of some natural formation that Mother Nature grew. The entire thing was called a theatron. But then you see in that center there, that flat circle called the orchestra, that's not where they would sit and play their musical instruments like in an orchestra pit today. That is the actual performing space, and it is a true circle. The seats on the curved area surrounding the orchestra, that's the cavea, that is all of the seats ranging up this natural hillside. And then down at the bottom, you see the skene, which is this building on which there was this platform that they could actually act on too. So there was this backstage area called the skene, even though you're dealing with an outdoor theater space. The most famous existing theater from this period is at Epidaurus in Greece. And there you go. Now, in this image, we're standing at the top of the theater looking down toward the orchestra. And obviously, one of the beautiful features of this kind of theater is Mother Nature's beautiful scenery. You're looking out on a Mother Nature's backdrop. These theaters are massive. They could hold thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And of course, this was before the days of amplification. There's no microphones and speakers. So, one of the beautiful things about this structure is that you could stand in the middle of that orchestra and you could whisper, and everyone in the audience can hear you. You see tourists doing that throughout the day, all through the day. It's amazing. Again, aiming at perfection, but you also see how the perfect circle, that geometry as a form of perfection, is one of the elements we're looking at here. And yes, while they're built into a hillside, usually there was some kind of man-made structure built into them too to form all of that seating. And I include this image so you have a sense of how steep this is. Everybody's got a perfect sight line down into the orchestra. Okay, we've been talking about structures up to this point, and now I want to move into talking about the decoration through the moldings and the motifs. When we're talking about moldings, we're talking about these beautiful freehand curves. None of these shapes are shapes that you could draw with a compass, but they're beautiful, complete curves. The ovalo and the torus in particular, we're going to see a lot of. Even the sima recta and sima reversa. You see all of these shapes throughout Greek moldings. And in terms of motifs, these are some of the most common. These are called the Greek key, or the fret, or the meander, because obviously the line meanders. But this kind of a shape is absolutely Greek. This is a quintessential Greek idea. Of course, the Greeks lived on the water, and that shows up in their decoration too. So here you have the Greek key that's been reinterpreted as a wave form. So these motifs are also very common in Greek architecture and decor. Let me show you what I mean. Here we have a beautiful piece of carved molding. There you have an egg and dart on the ovalo that's been carved in. And I've included on the right-hand side numerous drawings of what that egg and dart would look like. It is an egg shape with a dart in the middle. Egg shape with a dart in the middle. Then you have a torus shape that is also then carved into a bead and reel. So there's a bead and either side is a reel. And then it's another bead and a reel. Another bead and a reel. Here's another example. Up at the top, you have a leaf and dart, which is obviously a variation of the egg and dart. And then it looks like a bead and reel underneath it. Then a row of egg and dart, another row of the bead and reel that separates it all. And then you have that stylized natural form, very much like what the ancient Egyptians were using. This one is a stylized honeysuckle. So I want to point out that all of these are in horizontal bands. It's in a row. It's not all over the surface. It's just wherever you need a long horizontal line. And these motifs were carried through in lots of ways, not just in the carved moldings on buildings, but here is a molding, a painted molding from the site at Epidaurus. So here again, you see a honeysuckle motif there at the top, a row of honeysuckle, a row of a Greek key that actually has a bit of a swastika built into it. That is actually a very ancient form. And then underneath it is the bead and reel again. And just when you're thinking, okay, I got it, columns, a couple variations, decorative stuff, a couple variations, we have the caryatids. Again, at the top of the Acropolis in Athens, this is called the Porch of the Maidens for obvious reasons that it is a porch on the side of a temple, and the columns are actually human figures. So the Greeks used the engineering of a column, but also carved it into the very decorative shape of a human. And I got to tell you, each one of these ladies is unique. They are different. And so these columns, these caryatids, have told us a lot over the years about what dress and hairstyle was used at the time this was built. Of course, they are now missing their arms. They did have arms, but it's thought that one arm was extended forward with a palm up, like she's holding an offering to the gods. Also, I want to point out that these are not just standing straight up and down, their weight is on one leg. And the other leg is pushed forward, so we see that one knee pushing forward through the fabric of the clothing. So this is a relatively complicated pose that we're starting to see here. Okay, let's move along to look at other forms here. So let's get into decorated objects and furniture. So in terms of furniture, we're talking about mostly wooden furniture. Remember that the ancient Greek world had mountains with trees, so there's more wood than we saw in ancient Egypt. The legs were either turned or they had some animal form with, of course, the dog and the lion foot. And they used decoration with the carved relief and painting. And we're going to see the motifs that we've seen in architecture mimicked in the decorative objects. Here you see the klezmos chair, which is a curved-legged, curved-backed chair. I don't know that there's a straight line in these. So there's the very delicate looking, very graceful klezmos chair. Everybody needs to have a stool, so the Difros is a backless stool. We see it here in several forms. When we're talking about beds, we're talking about the Klein, which is basically a flat bench that has one end a little bit higher so that you can put cushions on top of it and then recline against it. And you can even see that they're high enough that there's another table that can be shoved underneath it. So you could have like a bedside table with your client. But furniture isn't the only kind of decorative thing I want to show you. We've probably all seen decorative pottery from ancient Greece. And I wanted to show you there's really two different styles. The earliest style, starting at about 700 BCE, is black figures on the terracotta. Terracotta is that orange color, and that's the actual color of the clay. So someone painted black figures onto the colored pots. A later version was making that clay pot, then covering the entire thing with a black glaze, and then scraping down through the black glaze to reveal the color of the clay itself. So those are called red on black. And these are later in the period from about 500 to the turn of the millennium. And I wanted to share with you several different types of these pots because the Greeks had pots for everything. You have your amphora that are used to store grains. And look at, I've shown you here both the earlier with the black on red and the later red on black. How beautiful. If you've read any Homer, they're always drinking wine. So there is the kylix, which is a flat drinking cup with these two handles either side that is basically a bowl that you could put your wine in to drink from. I particularly like the one on the lower right because down in the bottom of the kylix, what do we have? A man reclining and drinking wine. So it's probably a bit of a joke. A hydria was used to store water, but look, it has three handles, so you've got two that you can carry it with, but then there's one more handle that you can use to pour it with. And again, we've got several of different periods. I don't speak Greek, so I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce this. We have some oinokos here that are one-handled pitchers used for wine. And I'm not showing you these to overwhelm you with all of these Greek words. I just want you to start looking at them deeply and start getting a sense of the variety involved in this very complex society. Most of us have mixing bowls in our kitchens. The Greeks used this crater, which has this really wide top, and these two handles that are basically mixing bowls. And then there's the lekythos, which is this tall, beautifully delicate pitcher used to store oil. Again, if you've read any Homer or Greek tragedies, they're always pouring olive oil in memory of someone or to give honor at a grave. And so that is what you would use your lekythos for. And if you've been paying attention, you're also seeing that the images that are painted onto these pots all are telling various stories from ancient Greek mythology. In fact, we can see the same kind of iconography down through the years of telling stories of Athena talking with humans and sacrifices of bulls and all of those great adventures that you find in Homer, you're also going to find reflected on the sides of pots. And I know this is a lot, but I want to get to one more category. I want to look at sculptures. And I'm breaking this down into three different categories, the three different time periods, first starting with the Archaic period. Here you see these forms that look almost Egyptian, don't they? They're very rigid. They're kind of abstracted and stylized in some way. They're very symmetrical and column-like, and they all have something unique to the Greek Archaic period called the perpetual smile because, well, they all have this kind of curious grin. When we move later in time to the classical period, now we see something very different, don't we? Now we see these iconically beautiful characters of figures in motion. So we see dignity and strength, but still there is a sense of peace and serenity here. So this is one of the more famous statues of the classical period in bronze, thought to be either Poseidon throwing his trident or Zeus throwing a thunderbolt. We don't really know. But now you see this idea of the idealized perfect human form as a way to express the ideal of a Greek god. But look at that face. He doesn't seem to be terribly, he doesn't seem to have a point of view about what he's doing. He has a little bit of a facial expression, but it's not a portrait, is it? And again, in classical sculpture, I pointed out on the ends of the Parthenon, that triangle in the pediment, it invites decoration. And so here at the very top, you see what we believe was in that top decorative piece of the Parthenon. In the middle and the bottom images here, these are pieces that were literally lifted out of the Parthenon. They now live in London in the British Museum. So these are sculptures from that East pediment that we were looking at. And while they're not portraits, they definitely are in a much more casual positions, right? There is a sense of movement to each one of these. Of course, this arrangement of sculptures had to be jammed into a triangle, so that has everything to do with their shapes too. These central images here and this center here, those four images are down here in this piece of the pediment, whereas these figures here are over here on the right-hand side. So a lot has been lost over the years, but we do have some of these pieces. And when we move later in time into the Hellenistic period, now we're seeing even more emphasis on moving and twisting in space. This is the Laocoon group. Laocoon was the priest in Troy who said, I don't quite believe that this big horse is is just a gift from the Greeks. I'm curious about it. So he was the one who tried to see if that Trojan horse was a trick. And of course, it was a trick. He ended up being killed by giant snakes, by Poseidon or Apollo, depends on who you're reading. So this actually is a Roman copy of the original Greek statue. But you see what I mean about twisting figures, and now look at his face. You see this exaggerated detail. You see him suffering. So this is intense and richly emotional, which isn't at all classical. Now as we're moving into the Hellenistic period, we're getting much more interested in expressing emotion. Wow, that's a lot, isn't it? Okay, look at all the things we've talked about here. Thank you for your attention.